This kind of whispers was still going on, the men being bunched together forward watching for the barrel, when lo and behold you, here she comes again. Down she comes, slow and steady, and settles into her old tracks. You could 'a' heard a pin drop. Then up comes the captain and says, "Boys, don't be a pack of children and fools. I don't want this barrel to be dogging us all the way to Orleans, and you don't. Well then, how's the best way to stop it? Burn it up, that's the way. I'm going to fetch it aboard," he says. And before anybody could say a word, in he went. He swum to it, and as he come pushing it to the raft, the men spread to one side. But the old man got it aboard and busted in the head, and there was a baby in it. Yes, sir, a stark naked baby. It was Dick Albright's baby, he owned up and said so. "Yes," he says, a-leaning over it. "Yes, it is my own lamented darling, my poor lost Charles William Albright deceased," says he, for he could curl his tongue around the bulliest words in the language when he was a mind to, and lay them before you without a jint started anywheres. Yes, he said he used to live up at the head of this bend, and one night he choked his child which was crying, not intending to kill it, which was probably a lie. And then he was scared and buried it in a barrel before his wife got home, and off he went and struck the northern trail and went to rafting, and this was the 3rd year that the barrel had chased him. He said the bad luck always begun light, and lasted till 4 men was killed, and then the barrel didn't come any more after that. He said if the men would stand it one more night, and was a-going on like that, but the men had got enough. They started to get out a boat to take him ashore and lynch him, but he grabbed the little child all of a sudden and jumped overboard with it hugged up to his breast and shedding tears, and we never see him again in this life, poor old suffering soul, nor Charles William neither. "Who was shedding tears?" says Bob. "Was it Albright or the baby?" "Why, Albright, of course. Didn't I tell you the baby was dead? Been dead 3 years, how could it cry?" "Well, never mind how it could cry, how could it keep all that time?" says Davy. "You answer me that." "I don't know how it done it," says Ed. "It done it though, that's all I know about it." "Say, what did they do with the barrel?" says the child of calamity. "Why, they hove it overboard, and it sunk like a chunk of lead." "Edward, did the child look like it was choked?" says one. "Did it have its hair parted?" says another. "What was the brand on that barrel, Eddie?" says a fellow they called Bill. "Have you got the papers for them statistics, Edmund?" says Jimmy. "Say, Edwin, was you one of the men that was killed by the lightning?" says Davy. "Him, oh no, he was both of 'em," says Bob. Then they all haw-hawed. "Say, Edward, don't you reckon you'd better take a pill? You look bad, don't you feel pale?" says the child of calamity. "Oh, come now, Eddie," says Jimmy. "Show up, you must have kept part of that barrel to prove the thing by. Show us the bunghole, do, and we'll all believe you." "Say, boys," says Bill, "let's divide it up. Thar's 13 of us. I can swaller a 13th of the yarn if you can worry down the rest." Ed got up mad and said they could all go to some place, which he ripped out pretty savage, and then walked off aft cussing to himself, and they yelling and jeering at him, and roaring and laughing so you could hear them a mile. "Boys, we'll split a watermelon on that," says the child of calamity, and he come rummaging around in the dark amongst the shingle bundles where I was and put his hand on me. I was warm and soft and naked, so he says ouch, and jumped back. "Fetch a lantern or a chunk of fire here, boys, there's a snake here as big as a cow." So they run there with a lantern and crowded up and looked in on me. "Come out of that, you beggar," says one. "Who are you?" says another. "What are you after here? Speak up prompt or overboard you go." "Snake him out, boys, snatch him out by the heels." I began to beg and crept out amongst them trembling. They looked me over wondering, and the child of calamity says, "A cussed thief, lend a hand and let's heave him overboard." "No," says Big Bob, "let's get out the paint pot and paint him a sky blue all over from head to heel, and then heave him over." "Good, that's it, go for the paint, Jimmy." When the paint come, and Bob took the brush and was just going to begin, the others laughing and rubbing their hands, I begun to cry, and that sort of worked on Davy, and he says, "Vast there, he's nothing but a cub, I'll paint the man that tetches him." So I looked around on them, and some of them grumbled and growled, and Bob put down the paint, and the others didn't take it up. "Come here to the fire and let's see what you're up to here," says Davy. "Now set down there and give an account of yourself. How long have you been aboard here?" "Not over a quarter of a minute, sir," says I. "How did you get dry so quick?" I don't know, sir, I'm always that way mostly. Oh, you are you? What's your name? I weren't going to tell my name. I didn't know what to say, so I just says, Charles William Albright, sir. Then they roared, the whole crowd, and I was mighty glad I said that because maybe laughing would get them in a better humour. When they got done laughing, Davy says, It won't hardly do, Charles William. You couldn't have growed this much in 5 year, and you was a baby when you come out of the barrel, you know, and dead at that. Come now, tell a straight story and nobody'll hurt you if you ain't up to anything wrong. What is your name? Alec Hopkins, sir, Alec James Hopkins. Well, Alec, where did you come from here? From a trading scow. She lays up the bend yonder. I was born on her. Pap has traded up and down here all his life, and he told me to swim off here because when you went by he said he would like to get some of you to speak to a Mr. Jonas Turner in Cairo and tell him. Oh, come. Yes, sir, it's as true as the world, Pap, he says. Oh, your grandmother. They all laughed and I tried again to talk, but they broke in on me and stopped me. Now looky here, says Davy, you're scared and so you talk wild. Honest now, do you live in a scow or is it a lie? Yes, sir, in a trading scow. She lays up at the head of the bend, but I weren't born in her, it's our first trip. Now you're talking, what did you come aboard here for, to steal? No, sir, I didn't. It was only to get a ride on the raft, all boys does that. Well, I know that, but what did you hide for? Sometimes they drive the boys off. So they do, they might steal. Looky here, if we let you off this time, will you keep out of these kind of scrapes hereafter? Deed I will, boss, you try me. All right then, you ain't but little ways from shore. Overboard with you, and don't you make a fool of yourself another time this way. Blast it, boy, some raftsman would rawhide you till you were black and blue. I didn't wait to kiss goodbye, but went overboard and broke for shore. When Jim come along by and by, the big raft was away out of sight around the point. I swum out and got aboard, and was mighty glad to see home again. The boy did not get the information he was after, but his adventure has furnished the glimpse of the departed raftsman and keelboatman, which I desire to offer in this place. I now come to a phase of the Mississippi River life of the flush times of steamboating, which seems to me to warrant full examination, the marvelous science of piloting, as displayed there. I believe there has been nothing like it elsewhere in the worldbook 19K. Chapter 4. The Boy's Ambition. When I was a boy, there was but one permanent ambition among my comrades in our village on the west bank of the Mississippi River. That was to be a steamboatman. We had transient ambitions of other sorts, but they were only transient. When a circus came and went, it left us all burning to become clowns. The first Negro minstrel show that came to our section left us all suffering to try that kind of life. Now and then we had a hope that if we lived and were good, God would permit us to be pirates. These ambitions faded out, each in its turn, but the ambition to be a steamboatman always remained. 64K. Once a day a cheap, gaudy packet arrived upward from St. Louis, and another downward from Keokuk. Before these events the day was glorious with expectancy. After them the day was a dead and empty thing. Not only the boys but the whole village felt this. After all these years I can picture that old time to myself now just as it was then. The white town drowsing in the sunshine of a summer's morning. The streets empty, or pretty nearly so. 1 or 2 clerks sitting in front of the Water Street stores with their splint-bottomed chairs tilted back against the wall, chins on breasts, hats slouched over their faces, asleep, with shingle shavings, enough around to show what broke them down. A sow and a litter of pigs loafing along the sidewalk, doing a good business in watermelon rinds and seeds. 2 or 3 lonely little freight piles scattered about the levee. A pile of skids on the slope of the stone-paved wharf, and the fragrant town drunkard asleep in the shadow of them. 2 or 3 wood flats at the head of the wharf, but nobody to listen to the peaceful lapping of the wavelets against them. The great Mississippi, the majestic, the magnificent Mississippi, rolling its mile-wide tide along, shining in the sun. The dense forest away on the other side. The point above the town, and the point below, bounding the river glimpse and turning it into a sort of sea, and withal a very still and brilliant and lonely one. Presently a film of dark smoke appears above one of those remote points. Instantly a Negro drayman, famous for his quick eye and prodigious voice, lifts up the cry, "Steamboat a comin'," and the scene changes. The town drunkard stirs, the clerks wake up, a furious clatter of drays follows, every house and store pours out a human contribution, and all in a twinkling the dead town is alive and moving. Drays, carts, men, boys, all go hurrying from many quarters to a common centre, the wharf. Assembled there, the people fasten their eyes upon the coming boat, as upon a wonder they are seeing for the first time. And the boat is rather a handsome sight too. She is long and sharp and trim and pretty. She has 2 tall, fancy-topped chimneys with a gilded device of some kind swung between them, a fanciful pilot-house, a glass and gingerbread, perched on top of the Texas deck behind them. The paddle boxes are gorgeous with a picture or with gilded rays above the boat's name. The boiler deck, the hurricane deck, and the Texas deck are fenced and ornamented with clean white railings. There is a flag gallantly flying from the jackstaff. The furnace doors are open and the fires glaring bravely. The upper decks are black with passengers. The captain stands by the big bell, calm, imposing, the envy of all. Great volumes of the blackest smoke are rolling and tumbling out of the chimneys. A husbanded grandeur created with a bit of pitch pine just before arriving at town. The crew are grouped on the forecastle. The broad stage is run far out over the port bow, and an envied deckhand stands picturesquely on the end of it with a coil of rope in his hand. The pent steam is screaming through the gauge-cocks. The captain lifts his hand, a bell rings, the wheels stop. Then they turn back, churning the water to foam, and the steamer is at rest. Then such a scramble as there is to get aboard, and to get ashore, and to take in freight and to discharge freight, all at one and the same time, and such a yelling and cursing as the mates facilitate it all with. 10 minutes later the steamer is under way again, with no flag on the jackstaff and no black smoke issuing from the chimneys. After 10 more minutes the town is dead again, and the town drunkard asleep by the skids once more. My father was a justice of the peace, and I supposed he possessed the power of life and death over all men, and could hang anybody that offended him. This was distinction enough for me as a general thing, but the desire to be a steamboatman kept intruding nevertheless. I first wanted to be a cabin boy, so that I could come out with a white apron on and shake a tablecloth over the side, where all my old comrades could see me. Later, I thought I would rather be the deckhand who stood on the end of the stage plank with the coil of rope in his hand, because he was particularly conspicuous. But these were only daydreams. They were too heavenly to be contemplated as real possibilities. By and by one of our boys went away. He was not heard of for a long time. At last he turned up as apprentice engineer or striker on a steamboat. This thing shook the bottom out of all my Sunday school teachings. That boy had been notoriously worldly, and I just the reverse. Yet he was exalted to this eminence, and I left in obscurity and misery. There was nothing generous about this fellow in his greatness. He would always manage to have a rusty bolt to scrub while his boat tarried at our town, and he would sit on the inside guard and scrub it, where we could all see him and envy him and loathe him. And whenever his boat was laid up, he would come home and swell around the town in his blackest and greasiest clothes, so that nobody could help remembering that he was a steamboatman. And he used all sorts of steamboat technicalities in his talk, as if he were so used to them that he forgot common people could not understand them. He would speak of the labboard side of a horse in an easy, natural way that would make one wish he was dead. And he was always talking about St. Louis like an old citizen. He would refer casually to occasions when he was coming down 4th Street, or when he was passing by the planter's house, or when there was a fire, and he took a turn on the brakes of the old big Missouri. And then he would go on and lie about how many towns the size of ours were burned down there that day. 2 or 3 of the boys had long been persons of consideration among us because they had been to St. Louis once and had a vague general knowledge of its wonders, but the day of their glory was over now. They lapsed into a humble silence and learned to disappear when the ruthless cub engineer approached. This fellow had money too and hair oil, also an ignorant silver watch and a showy brass watch chain. He wore a leather belt and used no suspenders. If ever a youth was cordially admired and hated by his comrades, this one was. No girl could withstand his charms. He cut out every boy in the village. When his boat blew up at last, it diffused a tranquil contentment among us such as we had not known for months. But when he came home the next week, alive, renowned, and appeared in church all battered up and bandaged, a shining hero, stared at and wondered over by everybody, it seemed to us that the partiality of Providence for an undeserving reptile had reached a point where it was open to criticism. 68K. This creature's career could produce but one result, and it speedily followed. Boy after boy managed to get on the river. The minister's son became an engineer. The doctor's and the postmaster's sons became mud clerks. The wholesale liquor dealer's son became a barkeeper on a boat. 4 sons of the chief merchant and 2 sons of the county judge became pilots. Pilot was the grandest position of all. The pilot, even in those days of trivial wages, had a princely salary, from $150 to $250 a month and no board to pay. 2 months of his wages would pay a preacher's salary for a year. Now some of us were left disconsolate. We could not get on the river, at least our parents would not let us. So by and by I ran away. I said I never would come home again till I was a pilot and could come in glory. But somehow I could not manage it. I went meekly aboard a few of the boats that lay packed together like sardines at the Long St. Louis wharf and very humbly inquired for the pilots, but got only a cold shoulder and short words from mates and clerks. I had to make the best of this sort of treatment for the time being, but I had comforting daydreams of a future when I should be a great and honored pilot, with plenty of money, and could kill some of these mates and clerks and pay for Thejbk, 35K. Chapter 5. I want to be a cub pilot. Months afterward the hope within me struggled to a reluctant death, and I found myself without an ambition. But I was ashamed to go home. I was in Cincinnati, and I set to work to map out a new career. I had been reading about the recent exploration of the river Amazon by an expedition sent out by our government. It was said that the expedition, owing to difficulties, had not thoroughly explored a part of the country lying about the headwaters, some 4,000 miles from the mouth of the river. It was only about 1,500 miles from Cincinnati to New Orleans, where I could doubtless get a ship. I had $30 left. I would go and complete the exploration of the Amazon. This was all the thought I gave to the subject. I never was great in matters of detail. I packed my valise and took passage on an ancient tub called the Paul Jones for New Orleans. For the sum of $16, I had the scarred and tarnished splendors of her main saloon principally to myself, for she was not a creature to attract the eye of wiser travelers. When we presently got under way and went poking down the broad Ohio, I became a new being, and the subject of my own admiration. I was a traveler. A word never had tasted so good in my mouth before. I had an exultant sense of being bound for mysterious lands and distant climes, which I never have felt in so uplifting a degree since. I was in such a glorified condition that all ignoble feelings departed out of me, and I was able to look down and pity the untravelled with a compassion that had hardly a trace of contempt in it. Still, when we stopped at villages and wood yards, I could not help lolling carelessly upon the railings of the boiler deck to enjoy the envy of the country boys on the bank. If they did not seem to discover me, I presently sneezed to attract their attention, or moved to a position where they could not help seeing me. And as soon as I knew they saw me, I gaped and stretched, and gave other signs of being mightily bored with travelling. I kept my hat off all the time, and stayed where the wind and the sun could strike me, because I wanted to get the bronzed and weather-beaten look of an old traveller. Before the second day was half gone, I experienced a joy which filled me with the purest gratitude, for I saw that the skin had begun to blister and peel off my face and neck. I wished that the boys and girls at home could see me now. We reached Louisville in time, at least the neighborhood of it. We stuck hard and fast on the rocks in the middle of the river and lay there 4 days. I was now beginning to feel a strong sense of being a part of the boat's family, a sort of infant son to the captain and younger brother to the officers. There is no estimating the pride I took in this grandeur, or the affection that began to swell and grow in me for those people. I could not know how the lordly steamboatman scorns that sort of presumption in a mere landsman. I particularly longed to acquire the least trifle of notice from the big stormy mate, and I was on the alert for an opportunity to do him a service to that end. It came at last. The riotous powwow of setting a spar was going on down on the forecastle, and I went down there and stood around in the way, or mostly skipping out of it, till the mate suddenly roared a general order for somebody to bring him a capstan bar. I sprang to his side and said, "Tell me where it is, I'll fetch it." If a rag picker had offered to do a diplomatic service for the Emperor of Russia, the monarch could not have been more astounded than the mate was. He even stopped swearing. He stood and stared down at me. It took him 10 seconds to scrape his disjointed remains together again. Then he said impressively, "Well, if this don't beat hell," and turned to his work with the air of a man who had been confronted with a problem too abstruse for solution. I crept away and courted solitude for the rest of the day. I did not go to dinner. I stayed away from supper until everybody else had finished. I did not feel so much like a member of the boat's family now as before. However, my spirits returned in installments as we pursued our way down the river. I was sorry I hated the mate so, because it was not in young, human nature not to admire him. He was huge and muscular, his face was bearded and whiskered all over. He had a red woman and a blue woman tattooed on his right arm, one on each side of a blue anchor with a red rope to it, and in the matter of profanity he was sublime. When he was getting out cargo at a landing, I was always where I could see and hear. He felt all the majesty of his great position and made the world feel it too. When he gave even the simplest order, he discharged it like a blast of lightning and sent a long, reverberating peal of profanity thundering after it. I could not help contrasting the way in which the average landsman would give an order with the mate's way of doing it. If the landsman should wish the gangplank moved a foot farther forward, he would probably say, "James or William, one of you push that plank forward, please," but put the mate in his place and he would roar out, "Here now, start that gangplank forward. Lively now, what are you about? Snatch it, there, aft again, don't you hear me? Dash it to dash, are you going to sleep over it? Vast heaving, I tell you, going to heave it clear astern. Where are you going with that barrel? Forward with it, fore I make you swallow it, you dash, split between a tired mud turtle and a crippled hearse horse." I wished I could talk like that. When the soreness of my adventure with the mate had somewhat worn off, I began timidly to make up to the humblest official connected with the boat, the night watchman. He snubbed my advances at first, but I presently ventured to offer him a new chalk pipe, and that softened him, so he allowed me to sit with him by the big bell on the hurricane deck, and in time he melted into conversation. He could not well have helped it. I hung with such homage on his words, and so plainly showed that I felt honored by his notice. He told me the names of dim capes and shadowy islands as we glided by them in the solemnity of the night, under the winking stars, and by got to talking about himself. He seemed over-sentimental for a man whose salary was $6 a week, or rather he might have seemed so to an older person than I, but I drank in his words hungrily, and with a faith that might have moved mountains if it had been applied judiciously. What was it to me that he was soiled and seedy and fragrant with gin? What was it to me that his grammar was bad, his construction worse, and his profanity so void of art that it was an element of weakness rather than strength in his conversation? He was a wronged man, a man who had seen trouble, and that was enough for me. As he mellowed into his plaintive history, his tears dripped upon the lantern in his lap, and I cried too from sympathy. He said he was the son of an English nobleman, either an earl or an alderman, he could not remember which but believed was both. His father, the nobleman, loved him, but his mother hated him from the cradle. And so while he was still a little boy he was sent to one of them old, ancient colleges, he couldn't remember which, and by his father died and his mother seized the property and shook him, as he phrased it. After his mother shook him, members of the nobility with whom he was acquainted used their influence to get him the position of loblolly boy in a ship. And from that point, my watchman threw off all trammels of date and locality and branched out into a narrative that bristled all along with incredible adventures. A narrative that was so reeking with bloodshed, and so crammed with hair-breadth escapes and the most engaging and unconscious personal villainies, that I sat speechless, enjoying, shuddering, wondering, worshipping. It was a sore blight to find out afterwards that he was a low, vulgar, ignorant, sentimental, half-witted humbug, an untravelled native of the wilds of Illinois, who had absorbed wildcat literature and appropriated its marvels, until in time he had woven odds and ends of the mess into this yarn, and then gone on telling it to fledglings like me, until he had come to believe it himself. Chapter 6. A cub pilot's experience. What with lying on the rocks 4 days at Louisville, and some other delays, the poor old Paul Jones fooled away about 2 weeks in making the voyage from Cincinnati to New Orleans. This gave me a chance to get acquainted with one of the pilots, and he taught me how to steer the boat, and thus made the fascination of river life more potent than ever for me. It also gave me a chance to get acquainted with a youth who had taken deck passage, more's the pity, for he easily borrowed $6 of me on a promise to return to the boat and pay it back to me the day after we should arrive. But he probably died or forgot, for he never came. It was doubtless the former, since he had said his parents were wealthy, and he only travelled deck passage because it was cooler. I soon discovered 2 things. One was that a vessel would not be likely to sail for the mouth of the Amazon under 10 or 12 years, and the other was that the $9 or $10 still left in my pocket would not suffice for so imposing an exploration as I had planned, even if I could afford to wait for a ship. Therefore it followed that I must contrive a new career. The Paul Jones was now bound for St. Louis. I planned a siege against my pilot, and at the end of 3 hard days he surrendered. He agreed to teach me the Mississippi River from New Orleans to St. Louis for $500, payable out of the first wages I should receive after graduating. I entered upon the small enterprise of learning 12 or 1300 miles of the great Mississippi River with the easy confidence of my time of life. If I had really known what I was about to require of my faculties, I should not have had the courage to begin. I supposed that all a pilot had to do was to keep his boat in the river, and I did not consider that that could be much of a trick, since it was so wide. The boat backed out from New Orleans at 4 in the afternoon, and it was our watch until 8. Mr. Bixby, my chief, straightened her up, ploughed her along past the sterns of the other boats that lay at the levee, and then said, "Here, take her. Shave those steamships as close as you'd peel an apple." I took the wheel, and my heartbeat fluttered up into the hundreds, for it seemed to me that we were about to scrape the side off every ship in the line. We were so close. I held my breath and began to claw the boat away from the danger, and I had my own opinion of the pilot who had known no better than to get us into such peril, but I was too wise to express it. In half a minute, I had a wide margin of safety intervening between the Paul Jones and the ships, and within 10 seconds more I was set aside in disgrace, and Mr. Bixby was going into danger again, and flaying me alive with abuse of my cowardice. I was stung, but I was obliged to admire the easy confidence with which my chief loafed from side to side of his wheel, and trimmed the ship so closely that disaster seemed ceaselessly imminent. When he had cooled a little, he told me that the easy water was close ashore and the current outside, and therefore we must hug the bank upstream to get the benefit of the former, and stay well out downstream to take advantage of the latter. In my own mind, I resolved to be a downstream pilot and leave the upstreaming to people dead to prudence. Now and then Mr. Bixby called my attention to certain things. Said he, "This is 6 Mile Point." I assented. It was pleasant enough information, but I could not see the bearing of it. I was not conscious that it was a matter of any interest to me. Another time he said, "This is 9 Mile Point." Later he said, "This is 12 Mile Point." They were all about level with the water's edge. They all looked about alike to me. They were monotonously unpicturesque. I hoped Mr. Bixby would change the subject, but no, he would crowd up around a point, hugging the shore with affection, and then say, "The slack water ends here abreast this bunch of china trees. Now we cross over." So he crossed over. He gave me the wheel once or twice, but I had no luck. I either came near chipping off the edge of a sugar plantation, or I yawed too far from shore, and so dropped back into disgrace again and got abusage 83k. The watch was ended at last, and we took supper and went to bed. At midnight the glare of a lantern shone in my eyes, and the night watchman said, "Come, turn out." And then he left. I could not understand this extraordinary procedure, so I presently gave up trying to and dozed off to sleep. Pretty soon the watchman was back again, and this time he was gruff. I was annoyed. I said, "What do you want to come bothering around here in the middle of the night for? Now as like as not I'll not get to sleep again tonight." The watchman said, "Well, if this ain't good, I'm blessed." The off-watch was just turning in, and I heard some brutal laughter from them, and such remarks as, "Hello, watchman. Ain't the new cub turned out yet? He's delicate likely. Give him some sugar in a rag and send for the chambermaid to sing Rock-a-Bye Baby to him." About this time Mr. Bixby appeared on the scene. Something like a minute later I was climbing the pilot house steps with some of my clothes on and the rest in my arms. Mr. Bixby was close behind, commenting, "Here was something fresh, this thing of getting up in the middle of the night to go to work." It was a detail in piloting that had never occurred to me at all. I knew that boats ran all night, but somehow I had never happened to reflect that somebody had to get up out of a warm bed to run them. I began to fear that piloting was not quite so romantic as I had imagined it was. There was something very real and work-like about this new phase of it. It was a rather dingy night, although a fair number of stars were out. The big mate was at the wheel, and he had the old tub pointed at a star and was holding her straight up the middle of the river. The shores on either hand were not much more than half a mile apart, but they seemed wonderfully far away and ever so vague and indistinct. The mate said, "We've got to land at Jones's plantation, sir." The vengeful spirit in me exulted. I said to myself, "I wish you joy of your job, Mr. Bixby. You'll have a good time finding Mr. Jones's plantation such a night as this, and I hope you never will find it as long as you live." Mr. Bixby said to the mate, "Upper end of the plantation or the lower?" "Uppers." "I can't do it. The stumps there are out of water at this stage. It's no great distance to the lower and you'll have to get along with that." "All right, sir. If Jones don't like it he'll have to lump it, I reckon." And then the mate left. My exultation began to cool and my wonder to come up. Here was a man who not only proposed to find this plantation on such a night, but to find either end of it you preferred. I dreadfully wanted to ask a question, but I was carrying about as many short answers as my cargo room would admit of, so I held my peace. All I desired to ask Mr. Bixby was the simple question whether he was ass enough to really imagine he was going to find that plantation on a night when all plantations were exactly alike and all the same color. But I held in. I used to have fine inspirations of prudence in those days. Mr. Bixby made for the shore and soon was scraping it, just the same as if it had been daylight, and not only that but singing, "Father in heaven, the day is declining," etc. It seemed to me that I had put my life in the keeping of a peculiarly reckless outcast. Presently he turned on me and said, "What's the name of the first point above New Orleans?" I was gratified to be able to answer promptly, and I did. I said I didn't know. "Don't know." This manner jolted me. I was down at the foot again in a moment, but I had to say just what I had said before. "Well, you're a smart one," said Mr. Bixby. "What's the name of the next point?" Once more I didn't know. "Well, this beats anything. Tell me the name of any point or place I told you." I studied a while and decided that I couldn't. "Look here, what do you start out from above 12 Mile Point to cross over?" I don't know." You don't know," mimicking my drawling manner of speech. "What do you know?" I nothing for certain." "By the great Caesar's ghost, I believe you. You're the stupidest dunderhead I ever saw or ever heard of, so help me Moses. The idea of you being a pilot, why, you don't know enough to pilot a cow down a lane." Oh, but his wrath was up. He was a nervous man, and he shuffled from one side of his wheel to the other as if the floor was hot. He would boil a while to himself, and then overflow and scold me again. "Look here, what do you suppose I told you the names of those points for?" I tremblingly considered a moment, and then the devil of temptation provoked me to say, "Well, to be entertaining, I thought." This was a red rag to the bull. He raged and stormed so, he was crossing the river at the time, that I judge it made him blind, because he ran over the steering oar of a trading scow. Of course the traders sent up a volley of red-hot profanity. Never was a man so grateful as Mr. Bixby was, because he was brim-full, and here were subjects who would talk back. He threw open a window, thrust his head out, and such an eruption followed as I never had heard before. The fainter and farther away the scowmen's curses drifted, the higher Mr. Bixby lifted his voice, and the weightier his adjectives grew. When he closed the window he was empty. You could have drawn a send through his system and not caught curses enough to disturb your mother with. Presently he said to me in the gentlest way, "My boy, you must get a little memorandum book, and every time I tell you a thing put it down right away. There's only one way to be a pilot, and that is to get this entire river by heart. You have to know it just like a BC." That was a dismal revelation to me, for my memory was never loaded with anything but blank cartridges. However, I did not feel discouraged long. I judged that it was best to make some allowances, for doubtless Mr. Bixby was stretching. Presently he pulled a rope and struck a few strokes on the big bell. The stars were all gone now, and the night was as black as ink. I could hear the wheels churn along the bank, but I was not entirely certain that I could see the shore. The voice of the invisible watchman called up from the hurricane deck. "What's this, sir?" "Jones's plantation." I said to myself I wish I might venture to offer a small bet that it isn't, but I did not chirp, I only waited to see. Mr. Bixby handled the engine bells, and in due time the boat's nose came to the land, a torch glowed from the forecastle, a man skipped ashore, a darkey's voice on the bank said, "Gimme de yarpet bag, Mars Jones," and the next moment we were standing up the river again, all serene. I reflected deeply a while and then said, but not aloud, "Well, the finding of that plantation was the luckiest accident that ever happened, but it couldn't happen again in 100 years. And I fully believed it was an accident too. By the time we had gone 700 or 800 miles up the river, I had learned to be a tolerably plucky upstream steersman in daylight, and before we reached St. Louis I had made a trifle of progress in night work, but only a trifle. I had a notebook that fairly bristled with the names of towns, points, bars, islands, bends, reaches, etc., but the information was to be found only in the notebook. None of it was in my head. It made my heart ache to think I had only got half of the river set down, for as our watch was 4 hours off and 4 hours on, day and night, there was a long 4-hour gap in my book for every time I had slept since the voyage began. My chief was presently hired to go on a big New Orleans boat, and I packed my satchel and went with him. She was a grand affair. When I stood in her pilot house I was so far above the water that I seemed perched on a mountain, and her decks stretched so far away, fore and aft below me, that I wondered how I could ever have considered the little Paul Jones a large craft. There were other differences, too. The Paul Jones pilot house was a cheap, dingy, battered rattletrap cramped for room, but here was a sumptuous glass temple, room enough to have a dance in, showy red and gold window curtains, an imposing sofa, leather cushions, and a back to the high bench where visiting pilots sit, to spin yarns and look at the river. Bright, fanciful, cuspidors instead of a broad wooden box filled with sawdust, nice new all-cloth on the floor, a hospitable big stove for winter, a wheel as high as my head, costly with inlaid work, a wire tiller rope, bright brass knobs for the bells, and a tidy, white-aproned black Texas tender, to bring up tarts and ices and coffee during mid-watch day and night. Now this was something like, and so I began to take heart once more to believe that piloting was a romantic sort of occupation after all. The moment we were underway, I began to prowl about the great steamer and fill myself with joy. She was as clean and as dainty as a drawing-room. When I looked down her long, gilded saloon, it was like gazing through a splendid tunnel. She had an all-picture by some gifted sign painter on every stateroom door. She glittered with no end of prism-fringed chandeliers. The clerk's office was elegant, the bar was marvelous, and the barkeeper had been barbered and upholstered at incredible cost. The boiler deck, i.e., the second story of the boat, so to speak, was as spacious as a church, it seemed to me, so with the forecastle, and there was no pitiful handful of deckhands, firemen, and roustabouts down there, but a whole battalion of men. The fires were fiercely glaring from a long row of furnaces, and over them were 8 huge boilers. This was unutterable pomp, the mighty engines, but enough of this. I had never felt so fine before, and when I found that the regiment of natty servants respectfully served me, my satisfaction was complete. Chapter 7. A daring deed. When I returned to the pilot house, St. Louis was gone and I was lost. Here was a piece of river which was all down in my book, but I could make neither head nor tail of it. You understand, it was turned around. I had seen it when coming upstream, but I had never faced about to see how it looked when it was behind me. My heart broke again, for it was plain that I had got to learn this troublesome river both ways. The pilot house was full of pilots going down to look at the river, what is called the upper river. The 200 miles between St. Louis and Cairo, where the Ohio comes in, was low, and the Mississippi changes its channel so constantly that the pilots used to always find it necessary to run down to Cairo to take a fresh look, when their boats were to lie in port a week. That is, when the water was at a low stage. A deal of this looking at the river was done by poor fellows who seldom had a berth, and whose only hope of getting one lay in there being always freshly posted, and therefore ready to drop into the shoes of some reputable pilot, for a single trip, on account of such pilot's sudden illness or some other necessity. And a good many of them constantly ran up and down inspecting the river, not because they ever really hoped to get a berth, but because, they being guests of the boat, it was cheaper to look at the river than stay ashore and pay board. In time these fellows grew dainty in their tastes, and only infested boats that had an established reputation for setting good tables. All visiting pilots were useful, for they were always ready and willing, winter or summer, night or day, to go out in the yawl and help buoy the channel or assist the boat's pilots in any way they could. They were likewise welcome because all pilots are tireless talkers when gathered together, and as they talk only about the river they are always understood and are always interesting. Your true pilot cares nothing about anything on earth but the river, and his pride in his occupation surpasses the pride of kings. We had a fine company of these river inspectors along this trip. There were 8 or 10, and there was abundance of room for them in our great pilot house. 2 or 3 of them wore polished silk hats, elaborate shirt fronts, diamond breastpins, kid gloves, and patent leather boots. They were choice in their English, and bore themselves with a dignity proper to men of solid means and prodigious reputation as pilots. The others were more or less loosely clad, and wore upon their heads tall felt cones that were suggestive of the days of the Commonwealth. I was a cipher in this august company and felt subdued, not to say torpid. I was not even of sufficient consequence to assist at the wheel when it was necessary to put the tiller hard down in a hurry. The guest that stood nearest did that when occasion required, and this was pretty much all the time, because of the crookedness of the channel and the scant water. I stood in a corner, and the talk I listened to took the hope all out of me. One visitor said to another, "Jim, how did you run Plum Point coming up?" It was in the night there, and I ran it the way one of the boys on the Diana told me. Started out about 50 yards above the wood pile on the false point, and held on the cabin under Plum Point till I raised the reef, quarter less Twain. then straightened up for the middle bar till I got well abreast the old one-limbed cottonwood in the bend, then got my stern on the cottonwood and head on the low place above the point, and came through a booming 9.5. Pretty square crossing, ain't it? Yes, but the upper bar's working down fast. Another pilot spoke up and said, I had better water than that and ran it lower down, started out from the false point, Mark Twain, raised the second reef abreast the big snag in the bend, and had quarter less twain. One of the gorgeous ones remarked, I don't want to find fault with your leadsmen, but that's a good deal of water for Plum Point, it seems to me. There was an approving nod all around as this quiet snub dropped on the boaster and settled him, and so they went on talking. Meantime, the thing that was running in my mind was, now if my ears hear aright, I have not only to get the names of all the towns and islands and bends, and so on by heart, but I must even get up a warm personal acquaintanceship with every old snag and one-limbed cottonwood and obscure wood pile that ornaments the banks of this river for 1,200 miles, and more than that, I must actually know where these things are in the dark, unless these guests are gifted with eyes that can pierce through 2 miles of solid blackness. I wish the piloting business was in Jericho, and I had never thought of it. At dusk Mr. Bixby tapped the big bell 3 times, the signal to land, and the captain emerged from his drawing room in the forward end of the Texas and looked up inquiringly. Mr. Bixby said, We will lay up here all night, Captain. Very well, sir. That was all. The boat came to shore and was tied up for the night. It seemed to me a fine thing that the pilot could do as he pleased, without asking so grand a captain's permission. I took my supper and went immediately to bed, discouraged by my day's observations and experiences. My late voyage's notebooking was but a confusion of meaningless names. It had tangled me all up in a knot every time I had looked at it in the daytime. I now hoped for respite in sleep. But no, it revelled all through my head till sunrise again, a frantic and tireless nightmare. Next morning I felt pretty rusty and low-spirited. We went booming along, taking a good many chances, for we were anxious to get out of the river, as getting out to Cairo was cold before night should overtake us. But Mr. Bixby's partner, the other pilot, presently grounded the boat, and we lost so much time in getting her off that it was plain that darkness would overtake us a good long way above the mouth. This was a great misfortune, especially to certain of our visiting pilots, whose boats would have to wait for their return, no matter how long that might be. It sobered the pilot-house talk a good deal. Coming upstream, pilots did not mind low water or any kind of darkness. Nothing stopped them but fog. But downstream work was different. A boat was too nearly helpless with a stiff current pushing behind her, so it was not customary to run downstream at night in low water. There seemed to be one small hope, however. If we could get through the intricate and dangerous Hat Island crossing before night, we could venture the rest, for we would have plainer sailing and better water. But it would be insanity to attempt Hat Island at night, so there was a deal of looking at watches all the rest of the day, and a constant ciphering upon the speed we were making. Hat Island was the eternal subject. Sometimes hope was high and sometimes we were delayed in a bad crossing, and down it went again. For hours all hands lay under the burden of this suppressed excitement. It was even communicated to me, and I got to feeling so solicitous about Hat Island, and under such an awful pressure of responsibility, that I wished I might have 5 minutes on shore to draw good, full, relieving breath and start over again. We were standing no regular watches. Each of our pilots ran such portions of the river as he had run when coming upstream, because of his greater familiarity with it, but both remained in the pilot-house constantly. An hour before sunset, Mr. Bixby took the wheel and Mr. W. stepped aside. For the next 30 minutes every man held his watch in his hand and was restless, silent, and uneasy. At last somebody said with a doomful sigh, Well, yonder's Hat Island, and we can't make it. All the watches closed with a snap. Everybody sighed and muttered something about its being too bad. If we could only have got here half an hour sooner. And the place was thick with the atmosphere of disappointment. Some started to go out but loitered, hearing no bell tap to land. The sun dipped behind the horizon, the boat went on. Inquiring looks passed from one guest to another, and one who had his hand on the doorknob and had turned it, waited, then presently took away his hand and let the knob turn back again. We bore steadily down the bend. More looks were exchanged, and nods of surprised admiration, but no words. Insensibly the men drew together behind Mr. Bixby, as the sky darkened and 1 or 2 dim stars came out. The dead silence and sense of waiting became oppressive. Mr. Bixby pulled the cord, and 2 deep, mellow notes from the big bell floated off on the night. Then a pause, and one more note was struck. The watchman's voice followed from the hurricane deck. "Labboard lead there, stabboard lead." The cries of the leadsmen began to rise out of the distance, and were gruffly repeated by the word passers on the hurricane deck.